Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Center for Poverty Analysis, the 63rd Open Forum. We are focusing on something that has quite a lot of relevance to Sri Lanka and to households and to both men and women and those who are trying to manage their families and households during this very difficult time. The title is Household Work During COVID-19. And in typical CEPA style, the open forum is, as usual, based on some research that we have conducted on this topic past year, especially after the initial lockdown, or as we call it, a curfew was imposed in Sri Lanka in mid-March last year. So the findings are coming from those discussions and the data that we have collected. Two of the studies are from CEPA and then one from Dr. Asha Besekara. One of the things that I want to start off by emphasizing is the fact that the studies themselves and the data that has been collected is focusing on the intersection of gender and class. It's an issue that we will all have to address, mainly because of the way in which research could take place during the lockdown and who had access to particular segments of society in Sri Lanka. It's also about the fact and the important role that technology played during this period and who had access to such devices to actually engage through online portals to provide data for surveys and methods that had to be changed because of the way in which also changed during this time. So some of the questions that will probably come up and will be addressed is also about conducting research during such a time and what it meant for us as researchers and as think tanks to kind of reflect on the kind of data that we collected during such a period. But more or less, if you're looking at the overall arc of the presentations today and the whole idea behind it, is that they will touch upon some of the key issues that we have heard of, and personally, most of us have had to deal with. When the space that is the home is also then requisitioned for work, and when a household that has already a very set ways and rules, whether written or not written, obviously, but the way we work is completely changed within a household. How do people actually respond? And how do men and women then balance their work lives with their personal lives? Because what do you do when you have to work, but also in a sense during this period, homeschool your children as well? And then the other issue that flows into it is then who takes on those additional responsibilities that come into the household? And what bearing does that have on the working person's life? How do you kind of then balance out your responsibilities? And then what does that mean for anyone's mental health or mental well-being? How do you cope with such changes that are so rapid and that you had to deal with on a day-to-day basis? So this will be some of the aspects that we will be looking at, especially through the three presentations. And I'm sure that we will have a very engaging and constructive discussion, given the fact that there is data to reflect upon as well. But before we move on and before I hand over the presentation to Gayatri, a few housekeeping rules. If you're on Facebook, especially if you're on Zoom, please make sure that you are on mute so that there is minimum interruptions and interferences, especially because technology is involved. And please feel free to use the chat box on Zoom or on Facebook Live, because we are going live on Facebook, to comment and use that comment box to actually raise questions. If they are directed at a particular presentation or a particular aspect in the presentation, if you can please mention the name as well so that we can direct the question to that particular presenter. I think that's about it. So I will not take a lot of time. I know everybody is eager to hear the context and what we have to present from Sri Lanka. So let me first move on to invite Dr. Gayatri Lokuge, who is a senior researcher at CEPA, and she leads our livelihoods and employment research thematic. She has over 15 years of experience designing and conducting research in Sri Lanka and recently in other countries as well. Interestingly, her PhD thesis focused on how intersectional social identities shaped livelihoods in post-war contexts. Her research interests include post-war development and rebuilding, livelihoods, gender and intersectional identities, entrepreneurship, with a very specific focus on coastal communities. So over to you, Gayatri.
Thank you, Chandima. As Chandima in her introduction mentioned, we are presenting today some work that we carried out in 2020 at 2 points in the year. It's actually a very collective effort that Nadia and I am presenting today. If I start saying the names and mentioning the names of people by name that got involved in these studies, actually, almost all of CEPA, and of course, all the respondents that took their valuable time to engage with us in these studies. So, as I mentioned, it was a collective effort. There was a big team involved in this from CEPA's side, and it's also an ongoing exercise. So this sharing forum, this forum for sharing, today we also consider it as an opportunity for us to present this work and also get some feedback and also build a discussion around this topic. So a little bit of a background to the study. So when all of us actually had to go into curfew and lockdown in mid-March 2020, as researchers were, working at CEPA at the office, we were all made to, work from home suddenly. And one of the questions that, we started grappling with as people who are employed, full-time in most cases, was about, this need to capture some of our personal experiences and of course, the experiences of others as well at that point of time, because we also felt that it was quite unique in the fact that, the whole island and of course the global context was also quite similar in that our movement outside of the house was quite, completely restricted for about 2 months early last year. But at the same time, another question that we grappled with, and again, quite relevant to this study was, is this the right time to do, collect data, to talk to people about things like that for research? It's purely for research. And there was a constant back and forth on this question also for us. And then, also linked to that is this, what is the role of social scientists at a time like this? And what we decided was that, to conceptualize this study like a snapshot, so of that given time that we lived in. We conducted 2 waves of a quantitative study. The first one, as I said, was conducted in March to May 2020. When all of us were actually in curfew, so movement was completely restricted. And then we had another wave later in the year that was actually led by Nadia in November, December 2020. So in the quantitative study, in the quantitative component of this study, this research, we have to admit that it was a very limited sample in the sense that it captures the experiences and perspectives of those with access to web-based platforms and are willing to participate. So we did use a questionnaire, quantitative questionnaire through SurveyMonkey, and it was shared through social media mostly, and we tried to capture the responses of both men and women. The total response, it was a similar method that we used in wave 2 as well. And the total respondents for the 2 waves, the first wave we had 466, and the second wave there were 81. I think this number also reflects, in a sense, that in the first wave, when all of us were actually at home, people seemed a bit more willing to engage with this self-filling kind of questionnaires And in the second wave, we found that, you know, this willingness to participate was, you know, actually comparatively quite low, which is also reflected in the smaller number of people that we could reach in the second wave. We are only representing a descriptive analysis of the quantitative components today. We can, so when we, you know, did the number crunching, we could also observe similar trends in, you know, coming on from other cross-country regional studies that were conducted last year by other international agencies. We also had a qualitative component to this study. And in the wave one, so early in the year, we spoke to 11 men and women. And in the second instance, Nadia spoke to 12 men and women, more for like an in-depth, try to get an in-depth understanding of what their experience was like at these 2 points in time. So we've given the percentage breakdown of the sample in the 2 tables. Okay, so if I move to the some findings from the quantitative study first, quantitative component of the study, what we can see here in this graph is the change in contribution to tasks at home. So one of the things that we tried to understand was the set of tasks that we perform at home. How is this divided, or the contribution is different by for men and women? And you can see that in the first 3 columns of these graphs, there are similar trends. There's a similar pattern. So the light blue is what we call the COVID push, or this indicates the additional percentage of respondents who took up this function during curfew. So these are the number of people, the percentage of people who said that they're doing it more during this particular period of curfew in March to May, April to May last year. And you can see that in almost all of these, the first 3 columns, the tasks in the first 3 columns, there's been a change. And so there are both men and women saying that they're taking up more of these tasks. And it is very clear in cooking, for example. And you take the last 3 columns of the graph, it's also, it's showing the reverse trend, where actually more men seem to be spending more time performing these tasks before curfew. So the dark blue is actually before curfew. So if I again go back to the first 3 columns, although there's, as I said, there is an increase in more men, for both men and women taking these tasks up, the trend seems to be same as before curfew time, where the women are they are spending more time cooking, washing up after meals, and cleaning the house, including bathrooms. And the men who engage with the like non-daily tasks in a way, like grocery shopping, but also tasks that seem to involve movement out of the house. So this is the trend that we are seeing in the 2 in this 2 slides. So we had the before curfew and during curfew. So that was during curfew. And then in wave 2 as well, we saw, so that was conducted towards the survey that was conducted towards the end of the year also we see very similar trends. So very, very similar trends coming up. If I now move a little bit more in depth and drawing from the qualitative components of our qualitative component of our studies, what is a few things that are becoming quite apparent. The first is and this the set of extracts are from a discussion we had with actually a male university lecturer from the Eastern Province, from Batiklo. And the first part of the excerpts here show how the spatial boundaries of, the office and the home actually became blurred for this individual. But also the fact that he was able to allocate a space, like a physical space for himself to carry on his work from home tasks. So he had to deliver his lectures online. So he had to do the preparation and deliver lectures online. And here he says how he actually had the equipment, access to equipment. And also he managed to create a space for himself that he thought was conducive to the activities, kind of paid activities that he had to carry out. So this is mainly about the physical space within a household when this office, how we call it, office coming home. And then what is important is that he says that his wife's routine actually did not change at home. So this is compared to before curfew time, that, it actually was, it remained constant. There was no change except that their weekend outings actually had to stop. So this is obviously then the space for the wife to go out and interact. So that became constrained, not just for the wife, obviously, but for the whole family and for everybody. Then he talks about, how his work did get affected by children. So how, he found it difficult to cope with this, office coming home. And this is one way, the way he had, expressed his difficulties, that, he's competing, competition for space, actually, for the child and the father. And then, for him, and this actually kept recurring in his conversation with us, that his inability to engage, visit his father, which he thought as a person who could, for him, the important thing was that he could engage. So he used to visit his father almost every day in the evenings before curfew, but because of, movement restrictions, he could not do that. And this kept, worrying him. So this is also another angle of care that he obviously, felt was important. So here we are talking about, in this example of, these spatial boundaries, these physical spatial boundaries being taken away, were coming home, how this particular individual tried to cope with it. And of course, the way he was, one way that he was affected because of this movement restriction by not visiting his father. In contrast, we have a woman, again, actually a university lecturer from Ampara, who shared her stories with us. And for her, the interesting thing here, in contrast to the earlier case, is that she had a very, she had a routine and she had some demarcations before curfew time. So she would, she said, in general, I do not bring office work home. She would take a couple of extra hours in the university to prepare for her lectures. But she used to not bring any work home. But now, this obviously the office work came home and she had to cope with it. And she also said that some tasks that she had to do for university, actually that it was taking more time. Like, for example, preparing for Zoom, if it took like a lecture preparation took 3 hours before, when it was delivered in person, when it was online, she needed more time for preparation. And also the two lines at the bottom of the slide describes how she coped with this situation. So she says that this was actually before curfew. So in case of an emergency, she would actually reach out to her mother, who lived not too far away from her own house, to come and help out with children or doing household work. And if her mother could not come, she would actually reach out to her sister. And then, her husband. So this was actually, more or less her order, the order that she explained to us. So I think in this, so it's not just about also these spatial boundaries, like the physical space that we are talking about. We are also talking about the ability, you could call it like headspace or mental space, mental emotional space, to deliver tasks that were associated with both office or paid work, but also work that we carry out in the at home. the space for that. And then what happened when these boundaries became, they were actually taken away. And then we are going back again to our study, the quantitative study that we did in March to May last year, where we could see actually this, feeling of worry and anxiety were actually, quite high among both men and women. But in certain instances, for example, worrying about health, members of family members' health and possible health-related emergencies during curfew time, and the spread of the virus and the possibility of getting infected were actually quite higher comparatively for women than for men. And then we can also see that we could observe certain gendered patterns in feeling of worry and anxiety again, especially the more women had said, for example, how they feel tension with children had increased, and tensions with their spouse had increased, and also importantly how that they feel that they have less time for themselves during this time. Of course, this is both men and women. Women are saying this, but it's there's a slight difference between the two. So to wrap up my what I've been presenting so far, we could see that the trends, this gender division of household work that existed, that all of us know before curfew, so in normal times, we could observe very similar trends during curfew or when movement out of the house was actually restricted, and both men and women were at home. They had to carry out their work from home for both, and in certain instances we also found that they could not access their support network, so they could not reach out to the extended family members. They could not reach in certain households they could not actually get the services of paid help in the household or for looking after children. So these trends actually were quite similar. And then the work coming home was in a way gendered in that while both it obviously impacted both men and women. For women, and this is something I should have actually stressed a little bit more. In the case of the woman, the one particular example that I actually shared, she did tell us that in case that I could not finish my work within the day, like her university work, she had to then work from after 10 p.m. When the household chores were all settled, the children were settled for the night, for the day, she actually took up her university-related work. So this trend we could observe in other cases as well. So while the lecturer could actually he could still carve out some space within his day, like around 7:38 p.m. The woman lecturer said that there were instances where she could not actually do that. And then the last two slides showed from the quantitative survey how tensions, feelings of anxiety, and this loss of me time for both men and women. It was quite tensions were high. Their leisure time or their off time is actually reducing, but in certain instances, more women were expressing these feelings. And finally, we can also see how in trying to cope with this situation that we find ourselves in, where we have to reach out to our support networks in order to deliver these tasks, this work, the support networks are also gendered. So there is a tendency for women to reach out to their mother or the sister, as the example in one of our cases highlighted. I would now hand over to Nadia to talk a little bit more about the school coming home aspect of our studies. And I think before that, Chandima will give a brief introduction, introduce Nadia.
Thank you, Gayatri. A reminder again that you can post your questions if you have any clarifications from Gayatri. We will take it up at the end of the session rather than once the presentations are done, so that we don't interrupt the flow. So let me move on to Nadia, who was also part of the same team that looked at the same set of data, but also did her own piece of work after the lockdown came to an end. Nadia Najab is a research professional at CEPA and counts close to 10 years of research experience in the areas of post-war resettlement, labor and livelihoods, and employability of vocational training graduates. She's also a GROW Guest Fellow, which is the Gender Equality and Studies training program of the University of Iceland. She completed it last year. And Nadia also has a Master's in Development Studies from the University of Colombo. So over to you, Nadia.
Thank you, Chandima, for that introduction. So building on what Gayatri has already presented, I'd like to dive a little deeper into how COVID-19 has changed our lives and highlight the gendered nature of work within the household, with a particular emphasis on childcare responsibilities and distance learning, which was a consequence of schools being shut for extended periods of time. And schools in Western Province continue to be shut. So how individual households were affected and managed during this period is dependent to a great extent on what support structures are in place, both formal and informal. It also depends on the social, cultural, and economic factors which are influenced by where they live and what the conditions were like, especially with regard to gender relations, even before the pandemic struck. So when the first survey was conducted during the curfew, the restrictions imposed during the curfew meant that there was an increase in the amount of time spent at home for all members of the household, unless, of course, you were engaged in providing an essential service. Now, during this time, as you can see, it is interesting to observe among the survey respondents that in addition to the increase in childcare responsibilities, there was an increase in the participation in these childcare responsibilities by male household members, which can be seen by the light purple increase. It's the COVID push that created the additional percentage of respondents who took up these responsibilities during this time. Although there were visible improvements in male participation overall, we are able to see that for many aspects of childcare, it is still considered women's work. You see that the feeding, the bathing, the helping with homework, in every aspect except for playing with children, it is women who take the lead responsibility. So while the second wave is not directly comparable, what we do see is that the division of labor became much wider during this time. And this can be attributed in part to members of the household, particularly men, leaving back to return to physical work. And this meant that the gender responsibility of childcare fell back on women. So one indicator, however, between the two waves has remained constant. And that is when it comes to helping children with homework or learning. Majority of respondents, nearly 85%, indicated that it was female, most likely the mother, who was responsible for helping the child with school-based activities. And this has not changed throughout. So even before COVID or during COVID, or even now when there's a sense of caution imposed, this responsibility is still predominantly in the hands of the women. So now this home schooling has brought an added dimension of care that has been a result of COVID in particular. Based on conversations we've had with parents of young children, distance learning has become what I like to call a family affair. Whereas earlier, children would go to school to learn, today, school has come home. For learning at home, however, to happen successfully or effectively for that matter, if the learning was happening through, say, an online platform, a parent, most likely the mother, in the case of the survey respondents, the mother was responsible for helping the child to connect to the link. And most often, this also involved sitting with the child throughout the lesson. It also entailed ensuring that there was a space from where the learning could happen, where the child would not be disturbed. It also involved ensuring that the distance learning did not conflict with the parent's work schedule or a sibling schedule, especially if they were sharing a device. Most households did in fact share devices because before COVID, having a device for learning was quite unheard of. Now, for lessons that did not happen online, the ones that happen through worksheets or through WhatsApp or physical activity packs, parents were expected to dedicate time to help their child go through the allotted activities. This involved most often either writing down the activity on paper and having the child go through it, or in some instances, even printing them, having the child go through it, taking a picture, and then taking a picture and sending it back to the teacher to show the completed activity. Now, when it comes to working and teaching the child, this is a whole new skill set that a parent needs to have. And in addition to it being a skill set necessary, it also required time. For working parents in particular, this needed more time to adjust the schedules. There was one respondent who said, because she was a teacher, during the curfew time in particular, she found it very challenging to teach her students who were sitting for A-level examination because her children themselves had Zoom classes at those same times. So she actually requested the teacher to send the lessons later so she could sit with the child afterwards to complete the activity. This is very similar to how Gayatri told us about how parents would have to finish their official work later. So as we can see, parents have had to be more engaged than ever before, particularly for those with younger children. And overall, the survey showed that parents now spend upwards of 30 minutes with their children for distance learning. So this is something that for parents without a support system, COVID has brought an additional responsibility that we must consider. Now, imagine, if you will, that you're trying to juggle multiple responsibilities while riding a bicycle on a tightrope. If you drop any one of these responsibilities, it can have a negative impact on your ability to maintain your balance. Your child could fall behind at school, as could you at work. And this could have further negative impacts, particularly in a challenging economic environment in which we find ourselves. In addition to all this, you must also ensure that there is food on the table and the household continues to function. Whether COVID has the potential for increased female labor participation in the workforce is, however, dependent on a number of contributory factors. It needs to see whether you are successful in maintaining this balance is dependent on whether you have several levels of a support system in place. You'd need to consider whether the type of work you do allows for remote working. And if it does allow for remote working, whether it allows for flexible work hours, which allows you to attend to household responsibilities simultaneously. If you are in a relationship, does your partner's work also allow for flexible working conditions, allowing you to share responsibility, or is the responsibility then on a single individual? Do you have a dedicated workspace, or does your child have a dedicated workspace? Do you have extended family who will assist with childcare or other household responsibilities in the absence of formal care facilities? Or do you have someone to watch the kids while schools are not in session? Or do you have the option of continuing to work remotely while school also happens remotely? Are you in a position to have paid help in the household or not? And more importantly, are you digitally literate? Now, this means multiple things. Do you have access to a device, or do you even know how to use said device? Do you have internet connectivity? All these factors kind of play in to your ability to cope and manage and bear the responsibilities. If you look at this image, you see the gendered nature of the burden of COVID. You see a male sitting in his office working, while you see a woman who's juggling multiple responsibilities. She's working, she's looking after the kids, and she's making dinner, assume. So these are things that we will have to consider going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia, for that. Quite a few interesting ideas that were brought out. So hopefully we will be able to kind of pursue it a little further in the discussion. Next, I would like to invite Dr. Asha Abesekara, who is a senior lecturer at the Faculty of Graduate Studies, University of Colombo. She's also the program coordinator of the MA Masters in Gender and Women's Studies. Her main research interests are on the study of intimate relations and gendered subjectivities in contemporary South Asia. She's also the author of the book Making the Right Choice, Narratives of Marriage in Sri Lanka, which was published by Rutgers earlier this year. She will present, her presentation is aptly titled Tired All the Time, Homeschooling, Homeworking, Parenting, and Household Management During COVID-19 Lockdown. Over to you, Asha.
Thank you, Chadwa. Thank you, Chandima. So I have titled this, it's a quote from one of the respondents that I will present to you, because I wanted to highlight the prolonged physical isolation and how it has revealed the fragilities of the home and domestic life, and the implosion of time and space that is leaving us more and more overwhelmed and exhausted. So I started off this research towards the end of March, 2 weeks into lockdown, when I found myself, as an anthropologist, quite curious about what was going on with our lives. I was observing myself and wondering what was going on. And I was very curious to find out how the everyday, the routines and relationships enacted within the space of home and family were changing during this extraordinary time. Because I was reading in these psychology and health sites, international psychology and health sites, all this advice that was being dished out to parents, basically saying that children thrive on predictability and routine, and how schedules are critical for children's resilience and well-being. And I wondered then who was taking responsibility for household routines and children's schedules during this time. So in terms of my research methodology, I found myself as an anthropologist kind of at a really challenged, because I do ethnographic fieldwork. And the essential toolkit of an anthropologist is about being with people, looking at people, and talking to people. And it was very clear that that was not possible. So I turned to a complementary method, which are diaries, the diary method. And diaries are used by anthropologists and social scientists to sort of record and evaluate ordinary experiences. It also acts as a confessional device that encourages participants to reflect. I did. So I reached out to people within my networks, colleagues, students, friends, and 15 urban middle class women participated in the study between March and April. I sent them diary prompts for 4 weeks and asked them to respond to 4 questions. I asked them how to describe how they were feeling. My second question was, do you have a routine you generally follow? To describe an interaction or an activity from the past week. And my final question was, what aspects of your old life do you miss, and what aspects of your new life do you appreciate? So I want to say that as I was preparing for this presentation, I'm also in some ways reflecting back on the kinds of information that I got at that time, and I did some of the analysis in October, November for a short article that I wrote. And in a way that the interpretation has become more nuanced because of another study that I'm doing in this project called Off-Grid City. And this is looking at how the poor access services in urban working class neighborhoods. And that is a sharp contrast to the kinds of lives that I was looking at through the diaries. There is a student of mine who's also working on mental health and well-being during COVID-19. And of course, there's another student of mine looking at the kinds of calls that came in through the mental health helplines during the COVID-19 lockdown. So I'm kind of using these studies also as a foil in some ways to think about the findings from my short study, small study. So I want to, most of my findings are not different to what has already been presented by Gayatri and Nadia. And I thought it would be useful to kind of place a theoretical framework around the kinds of things that we are actually talking about. So for most of us here, you know, what we've heard and what you're going to hear from me in terms of findings are not anything unusual. We've spent a year now in this physical isolation, lockdown, social distancing, working from home. So I thought it was useful, it would be useful to think about how to frame it theoretically. So one of the key concepts, of course, is reproductive labor, which is referring to paid and unpaid activities that reproduce the workforce. And this is a very old concept that started with Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, that was looking at how the family was changing with sort of the introduction of capital. It moved to care work, which was looking at paid and unpaid work relating to caring for and ensuring the well-being of others. These were feminist economists like Nancy Fraser and Ferguson. And more recently, Bhattacharya's term social reproduction, which refers to activities and institutions that are required for what she says, making life and maintaining life. So here, making life, she says, is about giving birth, but it's the business and labor of maintaining and nurturing life that the focus is on in this presentation, which is about cooking and feeding, cleaning and washing, and of course, ironing of clothes. And all of this, if you take time to think about it, we all know that we do this, but these things are essential to what Marx and Engels was talking about, which is about the reproduction of the workforce. If we are not ironing and cooking and feeding people who are going into the workforce, there is no way, that is the unpaid care work that happens to keep the workforce functioning. Bhattacharya also talks about institutions that support social reproduction, a house to live in, schools, hospitals, public transport to go to various places, public recreational facilities such as parks and after-school programs. And this is something to keep in mind, because in the absence of some of these spaces that are available, like the school and public transport in some way, public recreational facilities, the way in which there is an implosion of space within the home. The second concept I want us to think about in terms of framing the findings is about gender and space. And here again, social geographers like Doreen Massey and Shilpa Ranade and Shilpa Padke have talked about how space is not a neutral backdrop against which social relations are enacted, but that gender relations are constituted by social spatial constructs. And here they're talking about concepts of danger and safety within space, the risk that women face in the public and domestic spheres, right? And here, sexual harassment in the workplace, domestic violence come to mind. And in a context in which we have spent most of our time inside the home, these are some of the issues that we need to think about, right? And then they talk about the idea of pleasure, right? And how women, in comparison to men, have conditional access to space based on how useful they are, and that they must always have a sense of purpose if they are in public spheres. That there is, in some ways, a denial of pleasure that women are afforded because they cannot, like men. And here they're Shilpa Ranade and Padke are drawing from a big study that they did in Mumbai, that they don't have the pleasure to loiter or gaze at others or hang out in public spaces in the way that men can. Right? If women are in public spaces, they need to be useful, and they need to have a sense of purpose. And we need to think about this idea of pleasure that has been used in terms of public spaces to think about what avenues of pleasure do women have when everything has imploded into the space of home. So my third concept, which Chantima has already talked about, is the intersection of class with gender, which creates inequalities, right? So here we really have to think about how the access to resources, including household income, education, not just the education level of parents, but also the investment that people make in children's education, occupation, the type of house that you occupy, and the social networks that you have access to, then shape the experience of being at home. And in some ways, the urban middle class lives that we are presenting, because I'm presenting, act as a foil for illuminating and reflecting on class disparities in experiences during COVID-19. And now, a year later, thinking about what a post-COVID-19 world will look like when there is so much discussion about, workspaces changing dramatically to moving into the home, working from home, flexible hours, and what that really means in terms of how that impacts women and men with the intersection of class. So I'm going, this is, as I said, nothing new, but there is the findings from the CEPA study and my study, and across the world, there is mounting evidence that the burden of social reproductive labor has disproportionately fallen on women, especially mothers with school-age children. And in the case of South Asian countries like Sri Lanka, the limited access to paid reproductive labor of working class women, only domestic workers, has only exacerbated the unequal division of unpaid labor based on gender roles and norms at this time. Right? So I took the quote that I used in my title from a woman who said to me that she was an academic who traveled quite frequently, and she felt that this time that she spent inside the home, she felt like her life was absolutely going nowhere. And she's one who said, "I feel tired all the time." So one of the things that sort of starkly stood out in the diary entries was the sheer volume of care work that went into sustaining life. So we live in a tropical country where the daily cleaning is absolutely necessary. Seems like Sri Lankan culture is such that we prepare 2 to 3 meals. There is daily laundry to be done, And of course, during the lockdown, there was the sourcing of groceries and household essentials, right? And one woman talked about, reflected about how it's a daily effort to manage the house and all of us in it. So in terms of homeschooling, women talked about how it was their duty and responsibility to monitor children's screen time. Women were extremely anxious about the amount of time children were spending in front of the screen. So they would be schooling, then moving to playing games, chatting to friends, to watching TV, and they felt like they needed to keep, you know, a tight control of screen time. And in case of younger children, mothers had to sit with younger children. And I'm hearing this is anecdotal evidence, not from the research, that the women whose mothers whose children are, specifically in grade 1 or moving into grade 1, that it's going to be that they would have to sit with their children from 7:30 to 12 or whatever the time limit there is, because there is no way that you can do online schooling with young children. Right? In the case of older children, mothers felt like they needed to oversee children's work. In terms of social networks at this time, women talked a lot about the amount of work that was required to keep an eye on elderly parents and relatives. A lot of them coordinated the deliveries of food and medicines to not only parents, but elderly aunts and uncles, neighbors that they kept an eye on, and of course, formed neighborhood groups to keep an eye out for the supply trucks that used to come. And at the beginning of the lockdown, we were not quite sure at what time food trucks would arrive. And so there was this kind of network of women who had formed WhatsApp groups and would keep an eye out for the trucks to arrive. When the trucks arrived, they would inform each other. What came out, I never asked about husbands, that husbands were helping with tasks, only when asked though. But women feel reflected on the fact that they did not share the burden of responsibility. So one woman talked about the fact that my husband has no other choice but to help around, because they had twin daughters and there was a lot of work, not with the daughters, but also with the number of pets they had. One woman sort of said to me, wrote in her diary, quite proudly, I felt, that even my husband cooks a curry when he's in the mood. And I couldn't help but laugh reading that, because it's the luxury of cooking a curry when he's in the mood that caught my eye. And another woman talked about how her father-in-law had moved in during COVID-19 because he was living alone. And her husband felt like watching TV with his father was the evening ritual, while she had to get dinner and take the kids to bed and watch cat videos to ensure that they went to sleep. So one of the main things that came out in the narratives, in the diaries, was how important middle-class women felt schedules were to managing their lives. And I think this is a really interesting insight in some ways, because it's also a way of presenting the self as organized, as coping, as being together. Because, in a way, my question was like, do you have a routine? And all of them felt, I feel, looking back, that they needed to show that they had a handle on things. So schedules were drawn up by mothers to manage the day, and a lot of them sort of very methodically talked about how they managed breakfast and clearing up with the children before school started. And then after that, work and school happened. So children went into their rooms and did their schooling while women went to work. There was then a break for cooking lunch. And then after lunch, there was solitary time. So everyone was supposed to be quiet, and people went into their little corners, into their rooms, and did their own thing. And then early evening was designated as family time, where once again you came together to do something, sometimes baking with children. watching TV, exercising, and then the day would end with cooking dinner with the help of children. So, just to illustrate some of the quotations from the diaries, the woman that I talked about before, she said that at the beginning, she slept in late because her children's school didn't start till about 10 o'clock. But then once her father-in-law moved in, she had to set the alarm so that she could make a cup of tea for her father, do the laundry, organize the kitchen, and get breakfast before everyone wakes up. A single mother wrote about how she wakes up at 5 a.m. So she has time for coffee, meditation, and an hour of work, and exercise, and get breakfast going. And she shared the morning routine with her mother. So there were some days that she would clean the house and get lunch. And on those days, she could not work. She would try to do that work at night. And then when her mother took over the morning routine, she would put in those hours at work. There were older mothers with older children who sort of got children to start doing work at home. I mean, these are households in which you were used to domestic help. So she talked about how her kids got into a routine and they would clean their rooms and their toilet, and then she would organize the rest of the day. And this was said again with a sense of pride that her children were now actually cleaning and arranging their rooms. So what came out was how the importance that middle class women, urban middle class women, placed on parenting or mothering in this case, right? And this is also extremely class because of the way in which time allows women to organize themselves in this way. So a single mother, the same person I talked about before, she said, I switch off early evening and spend time with my son playing games, organizing dinner, and watching. The mother of twin daughters talked about baking something for tea almost every day and how proud she felt of them because they were watching videos and teaching her how to bake. And then they would get into bed after dinner and watch cat videos and laugh together. The mother of a daughter of 17 and a son of 16 talked about how she organized family workout sessions in the evenings. These were sort of gym junkies, and how they all looked forward to it every day. And then, of course, it was followed by a movie night in the evenings. Right? And there was a lot of emphasis that even though there was so much time spent at home with the children, there was an emphasis on mothering that came out in the diaries. So, in conclusion, what comes out of the diaries is the tremendous labor that goes into maintaining households and families. And mothers emerge and mothers present themselves as the kind of organizers in chief of all of these things that are happening within the household. So for sure, as the study that CEPA has done has also demonstrated, the pandemic has exacerbated the unequal gender division of labor in middle class households, and schedules and routines, my diary showed, have become indispensable mechanisms through which middle class women organize their multifaceted lives and responsibilities and try to get some time for themselves as well. And we need to reflect on what it means, what the pandemic has done to the idea of the space that we call home, where before we saw home as a place you come back to, retreat, relax, decompress. This relationship has changed dramatically because our homes have now become our whole world. Right? It's the office, it's the gym, it's the school, it's where we manage our social networks. And in terms of what enabled coping and managing, it's important to reflect back, as I said, about sort of thinking about the fact, this is something Nadia brought up as well, that women were able to cope and manage because they had access to certain kinds of resources, especially in terms of space. Children were, were able to go into their spaces and do their homeschooling while mothers could work in a separate room for the most part. Each person in the household had a device, whereas the people that I'm talking to now in the Vattas, they actually share one device amongst 2, 3, sometimes 4 children. So they actually sort of school at different times of the day. The fact that you had time and space for recreation, even though it was at home. And so these are the kinds of things that enabled women to cope and manage within an urban middle class household. Of course, this is one version of a set of stories that came out from 15 diary entries. There is, of course, a host of other evidence that's coming out with regards to domestic violence across all classes, that it has increased during the COVID-19 pandemic, both in Sri Lanka and in the world. There is a lot of evidence now coming out again about the impact on mental health and well-being. Women are feeling more and more stressed. There is fear and there is anxiety. So, 1 year down the line, these are some of the things that we need to think about as, our children continue to be at home. Schools have not started in Sri Lanka. Talk about moving officers into the home. These are some of the things, I suppose, that we need to think about as we reflect on what happens in the post-COVID-19 world. So I'll end there, leaving you with this quote by Clooney, who says that the current situation is almost prophetically designed to showcase the farce of our societal approach to separating work and family times.
Thank you, Asha. I really like that organizers in chief, which basically talks about how difficult this whole the juggle that women had to kind of engage in order to make sure that the household, as you said, managed during this time period. Considering the 3 presentations we have had so far, talking about different aspects, and also looking at how women coped or how men responded to all of this, I would now invite Ms. Madhavi Gunawardena, who is our discussant, to reflect on these findings and also to speak on the different angles that were touched upon by the speakers. Ms. Madhavi Gunawardena joined the public service in 2006, so she's pretty much completing 15 years in public service. And during this time, she has held multiple positions before joining the Labor Department. She is currently the Commissioner of Labor for Women and Children's Affairs at the Department of Labor. She's also a recipient of the Australia Awards Scholarship Program, and through this completed her Masters in Human Resources and Employment Relations from the University of Western Australia in 2017. She also has a Master's in Public Administration from the Open University of Sri Lanka. So over to you, Madhavi.
Thank you, Chandima, for that lovely introduction. And Dr. Gayatri, Nadia, and Dr. Asha, I couldn't stop myself from getting all these images of my work colleagues, my friends, who were juggling their life with work, family, education, studies, all these things, while you were bringing out all these facts and figures on the research that you have been doing. It's interesting to note that, like, while most of us were thinking what to do, by March, April itself, you have started doing your research and thinking, okay, what we are going to do, how we are going to do. I think up until very recent times, we were thinking that some of the studies that we were doing was one of the most first studies that we have been doing, like in early April, May. But then your study, Dr. Asha's study, actually has even commenced before that. So I applaud on that first. And then, yes, we have difficulties on the research method. Yes, we could not, you could not capture everyone because of the technical difficulties and the online divide, and actually the digital divide, where we could only gather information from those who had access to these devices. But still, from these findings you have got, we can definitely project both upwards and downwards to make sure that we know what we are doing and even the policy directives. So combining all these three aspects and like your views, we come at this conclusion, okay, COVID-19 increased our household work and the gender division increased, and more than anything, the work came home along with the school. So that is the most important part of this dialogue, I think, where you no longer have a division between the home and the school or home and the work. As Dr. Asha said, okay, now our whole world is home. And from Dr. Gayatri's study, when you say that 95% of both men and women said that it's difficult to work from home due to the care, household chores and care responsibilities, I'm thinking, are we on the correct path? Because we are trying to introduce flexibility into our labor law. We are trying to introduce different norms of flexibility. So I think we need to start discussing this more. And at the same time, increasing female labor force participation. Unless we give, as you all pointed out really clearly, unless we give the supporting factors to our females, all the supporting hands, it's not going to be easy, even though we are going to introduce the flexibility. Yes, flexibility into work has to happen. It has to be reflected in laws, but then for it to be utilized successfully, we have to make sure that this network has to be strengthened and that we have all this support from everyone. And what can we foresee in the future? What do we need more? I would really like to see the three of you talking on another forum on this boundary, how it had happened between the work life, like the physical space, mental space. Yes, we talked about, but like whether the times that we have been taking, like for example, I have had people who are continuously working. Very recent, one of my colleagues said, now we need to take a break because the home is not giving that break anymore. We don't stop work and go home. We don't stop work at home and come to work. So that is the difficulty. And at the same time, the education and the work, the gendered responsibility, okay, the mother has to look up. The mother has to do this. Mother has to make sure that the education has to go on. So these things, I would really like to see you talking more and creating more awareness on it. And Dr. Asha said a very nice thing about organizing diaries, maintaining routines, going into schedules. Not all of us have this ability to organize our lives like that. Small, young, oldest, elderly, everyone, not every one of us can, break our day into different parts to say, okay, in the morning I'm going to do this, after this I'm going to do that. So what is going to happen to those people who cannot do it? Have they not survived? So maybe in another platform, if we can discuss that part as well, that would be really interesting. And yes, so that is my view on all this, and I know there are a lot of questions with Chandima that has to be asked and discussed. Thank you.
Thank you, Madhavi, for that. I think, listening to all the presentations, listening to Madhavi's comments, what we are also drawing out is this concern of the blurring of lines, as Gayatri put it. The fact that, as Madhavi said, you are bringing, there is never that now clear line between work and home, and then the loss of that space that Asha talked about. All of these things come into play. So then this also then raises questions, as Madhavi also pointed out, about flexible hours, about the policy responses that we are even considering. And then we also have to then raise the question of, is this well thought out? Has the pandemic taught us, if the pandemic has taught us anything, and the lockdowns have taught us what women's roles will look like? Shouldn't we also then rethink the way we consider work and flexible hours, and what kind of support women need? Some of the questions are directed at the researchers themselves. So I will first go through some of those questions and then go into much more general questions about, as we said, these policy responses and other aspects that may not have, that have raised further questions that we need to kind of ponder. The first two questions I'm directing at Gayatri because it's basically from the study itself. One of the questions was there whether there was any kind of support for the women at the community, whether there was any community support for the women, and if so, what was the nature of that support? So that's one question. And the other one is, how has domestic workers, which is an interesting aspect to look at as well, affected the gender dynamics within the household? What does the data say? So basically from the survey, and how has the pandemic affected the domestic workers themselves? I'll go to Gayatri and then we'll come back and look at the other question.
Thank you for the questions. I think I'll take the first one about community support first. So as I explained, the first wave of the quantitative study and then the linked qualitative component happened, took place actually during curfew. And then there was proper island-wide curfew from, if I remember right, from about late March to for about 2 months. So at that point, actually, there was no community support possible in any way. But I think this came out in Asha's, and I believe Asha, I think it would be good for Asha also to reflect a little bit on that, because if I remember right, maybe she presented it, the story today, or she mentioned it to me at an earlier date, that the community aspect came into being, especially when it came to sourcing, household goods like day-to-day dry rations or fish and things like that. So that in certain neighborhoods that there were these systems of, like, there were WhatsApp groups, and there were systems where they would actually pass information around. So that this was one instances where the community could play a certain role without actually physically moving out of the house or violating curfew laws. But it also depends on how we actually define community, in a sense. If we do define community in a sense of extended family, including extended families as well, I think we did find, especially in the first wave of a study, not necessarily during curfew time, but before curfew, there was a presence of extended family members within the sample, so people, men and women that responded to the survey, they had mentioned that there were elderly, especially elderly men and women within the household. And we did see that they were also, playing certain tasks. They were playing certain roles and performing certain tasks within that household. So we did have some questions about time spent on tasks, and we could see that these people were also actually then contributing to the household tasks. And in that sense, it was also we could see that, especially for women who were, engaging in paid work, that in such households, there was actually there was a contribution from these other household members. But as I said, it really depends on how we define community. So those are two, I think, specific examples and facts that I could share. But and then the second point on domestic workers. Again, what we observed, and I think Nadia also found this later on in the year, that there was definitely there was like paid help within the households, that in some of the households that we studied. Again, I'm sorry, I don't have the numbers right now with me, but we are happy to share the numbers with whoever is interested later. And And then there was a point where if this help was actually not live in and they were daily commuters, then they were actually not part of the equation anymore. So in those instances, also we found, and this was more from this qualitative study, qualitative interviews that we are explaining this, not so much from the quantitative. We did see, so these people could actually not move, especially during curfew time. Of course, no travel was possible, but then when curfew was lifted, travel was still physically, technically possible, but there was a reluctance to bring this help in because of, risk of bringing the virus. So then we did find some instances where the help was stopped, and then of course in certain cases we saw that these paid care workers were actually given some kind of financial compensation, sometimes in full, sometimes half, sometimes not at all. So we could observe all these, it was a range of practices that had taken place. And so it actually continues. So we did not, unfortunately, talk to any of these service providers themselves. But so we cannot actually, explain how they were impacted by this themselves. But what we can tell is the other side of the story a little bit.
Thank you, Gayatri, for that. I'll come back to you with another question, but first to Nadia. There's a question from Jayanti. Do you have a gender breakdown to how the tasks are divided up? Quite intrigued by the title, Family Affair.
Thank you for that question. So yes, we do have a breakdown. During the second wave is when we asked this question about household engagement with education. And what we found was 85% of the sample were female who were engaged in education-related activities, which is quite high. This is not to say that we didn't have male respondents who were helping, but 85% of them, of the respondents, were female who said that they were responsible for children's education. The reason why I did title it a family affair, however, was because it was no longer a one-on-one contract of teacher-child or a single parent and child of just simply learning or helping with homework. It involved managing schedules of an entire household, whether it involved sharing a device with whether a parent needed to schedule their meetings around the child's distance learning, or whether if there were multiple children in a household, whether they had to navigate when or what time or who would use a device. Those were all the aspects which came into being. In one particular example, where there was a father who was more involved with the teaching or the child's education, that happened because the father's number of hours work was curtailed because of COVID. So he was then responsible for the child's work while the mother continued to engage in full-time employment. Yeah.
Thank you, Nadia, for that. Asha, there's a question for you, which is also based on the findings that you presented. The idea of loss of time for pleasure, relaxation, and loss of leisure time is something that came to mind when Asha spoke about space. How does this impact men and women and even children, and how they manage this in the confines of the home space and the lack of the ability to go out and socialize? So the differential impacts on children, on adults, etc. How much would you think that this impacts mental well-being? Any thoughts from your end, Asha?
For that question. So in terms of leisure time, and I can talk now about, I guess we need to think about what it was like then and what it is like now. One of the women that who wrote in the diaries for the 4 weeks talked about, she was a part-time, she worked part-time, and she arranged her schedule around her children's school schedule. And she said how much pleasure she took in driving. So she lives in Moratuwa. So it was a long drive to Colombo to drop the children at school. But all of these things of dropping the kids at school, hanging around and chatting to other mothers, picking up and chatting, then the time that she spent at work for a few hours before she had to pick up her kids, that was clearly something she missed, because here she was now at home with her husband, father-in-law, and 2 children, and no one else to really talk to. And she talked about in her diary about how she would actually go through her photographs to remind herself that she had a life before the lockdown, reflecting to sort of the time in which things have opened up and people have freer movement in Sri Lanka. There is, I think, a sense of anxiety that comes out of, I mean, this is again conversations I've had informally with lots of women around an anxiety about going out, partly born out of having been isolated for so long, partly because they worry about leaving children at home because they're restricting children from socializing, and how do they sort of justify to themselves that they need to go out and meet with friends. So there is a real sort of tension there around safety and mental health being that I find that women are grappling with, and the loss of has also has been taken away, and women are isolated in the home. That has also really affected the way in which pleasure is possible and leisure is possible. So you can see that even with women, like there is a conflation into sort of, as much as we complain that we are weary of Zoom, that we end up now sort of going, I mean, this is middle class women, right? Like going on sort of Netflix binges as not just in Sri Lanka, this is across the world. With regards to working class women, these are the things that are coming out with the study that I'm doing right now. A lot of women talked about the kind of sort of feeling of frustration that the children and husbands and everyone's at home. So these are 2-perch houses in which there are 6, 7, 8 people living together. And at times during the lockdown, there were police patrolling the narrow streets, not allowing them to even come out, because the usual way of socializing is that people would sit on the steps and talk to each other across doorways. And at a time, even that wasn't allowed. They had to actually shut the door in and wait inside. And there is a real frustration that there is so much noise in the household, with so many people in the household, day in and day out. And that women who found leisure and pleasure, just going to the kade, hanging out, the clothes, doing their kanta samiti work, that all of that has been affected by the social distancing rules that are in place right now.
Thank you, Asha, for that. Quite interesting ideas are coming out. They're thought-provoking. It makes you think about how women have tried their best to kind of manage and balance, but at what cost, right? And there is a question that I will put out to all of you. I think it's also kind of challenging to look at it in a different way, and then also to respond to different ways of looking at this issue also. So the question is, in Sri Lankan society, woman has always has been able to manage household work and office work both before the pandemic. So it is so it's not a huge task for them due to their working capacity, like handling it during pandemic. But I think it is different for men, and managing both sides during pandemic is kind of a challenge. So basically saying that women can still manage even when there are extenuating circumstances such as the pandemic. But it's probably the men who have had to kind of rethink and revisit their role. And any thoughts about this? How I would like to frame this is in 2 ways. Have women actually managed to balance everything before the pandemic? And if so, at what cost? Asha talked a lot about, these coping mechanisms or the way women try to kind of schedule everything. So that is one question I have from this. And the other one that I draw out is also one of the gaps that we also see in these studies that have been presented is what exactly has been the role of the man, especially within a household, within the family. So how do we reconcile to that? Is it unfair to focus too much on the women? And are we doing it at the cost of looking at how men have also grappled with specific psychological and also care work related issues that came up during the pandemic? I'm just putting the question out there because I think that also creates a lot of debate, and it's something that we have to deal with because we are talking about gendered relations within the household. If I may, I'll start with Gayatri, and we'll go around the table, and hopefully Madhavi can also come in because coming from the Labor Department and from knowing what the work life looks like, especially in the formal sectors, and Asha as well. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. So I think there were, I think I'll break it in, I think Chandimal also broke it down into two parts. So the first one, I think I would like to pose a question of my own. So if we do say that women had actually been managing, a question that I would like to pose back is actually at what cost to themselves, especially. And these costs, and I'm not even, you could talk about financial economic costs, but also, costs beyond this. For example, do we know enough of the effects, the toll that that this kind of managing takes on our physical bodies to start with, right? Do we know enough of, especially, when you are 60 plus, what are the, the health related complications, especially related to nutrition, nutrition aspects, BMI kind of aspects that women go through and men go through. I think there are some studies available within the Sri Lankan space, Sri Lankan academic space as well. I won't go into a lot of detail on this, but I think what I would like to actually do here is to question, what I said earlier, at what cost to, so it could be, yes, you do manage, but if the woman in the household then does not get enough sleep, for example, and over a period of time, you don't get enough sleep. We all know what happens to the body first, and then, our mind, and, our spiritual life as well. So I think the effects, the cost would not be even felt right now. It could be probably, a woman and a man would feel this, in the later stages of their lives. So that's how I would respond to that first component. And then the second question, I think, very important about, what are the effects on men and how do they cope? And I think in most cases when we in the qualitative responses also to our study, what we saw was that men in general actually admitting the role that the woman in the household is actually playing. I mean, we did not present that part of the study, but we did ask questions about, do you think your spouse's workload had actually increased? And we could see clear indications of, men saying that, it had increased a lot more. So I think in a sense, on the one hand, the men seem to be aware that the household is being run and these different tasks are falling into place because the women are actually playing a role. But then that impact of this on their own selves, I don't think actually it came out that explicitly in our discussions with men. And this itself, I think, raises an interesting question of you know, whether there are, and I think certain studies already, many international studies, global studies do say that, you know, there are gendered ways of coping with, you know, with situations like that. So when, for example, a woman, this is a very crude example of woman would actually reach out in any way that they can to the networks, but when they have a problem, but would the men do similar things, or would they do different things? So I think the coping mechanisms themselves are clearly different, but interestingly, in our studies, this did not come out that explicitly. So we could also, you know, assume that this is also, you know, part of our socialization process, that women and men obviously express themselves and, you know, of their coping, of their support networks in very different ways. So I think I will stop there. But as Chandima said, this is an important part of the class aspect is an important part of the broader discussion that we've been having, and that we should continue going forward on this particular topic.
Yes, so my 2 cents on this. The female labor force participation has been around 35% for the past 10 years. If the women have been managing it so well, given the fact that the you know, the other educational achievement and all those things are higher than the males in this country, this should at least be increasing if the women are really managing it well. So, you know, there's that. So I will just continue from Dr. Gayatri. So are we really accepting that we are managing it well, or is it just some sort of mental conditioning that we are saying, okay, the women are better at managing this, or they can do this, or they can balance everything, but not the men? Are we being fair to the men who are balancing everything and doing it? We have enough single parents or men who are looking after the kids. And like, so I will stop at that, because this is some broader discussion that we have to continue. But at the same time, that I'm very sure that this 35% will not be there, and I would not have had to go and talk about increasing female labor force participation in the morning today as well, if the women were doing so well, balancing, you know, the home, education, and the work and everything together. Thanks.
Okay, so one thing I'd like to say in response to that question is, even if they have been coping, should they continue to cope in the same way? It's something that we should definitely think about in the future. As Madhavi also said, if the women have been coping successfully, wouldn't our labor force participation rate actually be much higher? There's also a factor for the Sri Lankan context, is that the women might have been coping successfully to some extent, depending on the support networks they had. Now, when we did the second wave of the survey, that was something we were actually keen on looking at, which was whether there were extended family networks which helped women to continue, especially women who are already engaged in the labor force, whether they were able to continue working and managing all these additional responsibilities in the event that they didn't have these support networks, especially in the urban setting where the family is a nuclear setup and there are less extended family support networks. In that case, it'll be necessary for men to also engage in order, pretty much like how Gayatri said, for there to be a continued stability in like mental well-being, because a person's overall well-being is not just physical or mental, it's everything put together. I think I'll leave it at that.
Just have a short response to that question, and that is with regards to, you know, that there is a kind of sort of discursive violence on women when we talk about women as being able to cope, to manage, and then, of course, before all of this, balance. These are not words that we use to talk about men's lives, right? And if you think, psychologically, if you think about what coping means, is that you have adequate resource or just about enough resources to meet a challenge. Stress is caused when you don't have the psychological resources to meet the challenge. So managing is, maybe just a little bit more than that. And we are not looking to, are we actually interested in saying, okay, if women have coped and they've always coped or managed, then what's the problem here? It's men's well-being that we should be thinking about because they are now falling apart. This is a discursive violence on women's lives because we are looking, if you talk about well-being, we're thinking about flourishing, right? And we have to really think seriously about moving from sort of thinking that people are coping and managing and balancing women into really rethinking about what it means to flourish as human beings.
Thank you, Asha, for that. I mean, I do understand where the question is also coming from, the need to kind of balance both sides of the story, but then also understanding how these experiences are also so differential and the way you kind of absorb it, as you said, is also different. And how we kind of reconcile all this are the questions that we are trying to deal with, especially because this is unprecedented. And we are seeing work and education, as Madhavi said, everything coming back to the household, and that those lines are again becoming blurred. We still have about 15 to 20 minutes. So I would like to maybe start talking a little bit more about the macro level, at what kind of responses do we kind of expect, or do we think is required in moving forward, because obviously there was a lot of talk initially about this being the new normal and how we are all going to behave and be better people in the new normal, but really what has actually changed, especially for women in a household managing all of this and this added burden that has been now set on their shoulders. So one of the questions, and I will ask all the presenters and Madhavi to actually respond to this, because this is, I think, one of the key things that everyone wants to know. So what about all this? So what can we do? The question is, what would you say are your top 1 or 2 solutions that would change things for the better? So you can probably reflect on what we mean by better, and also for whom. Is it at the household level? Is it for the individual? Or and also reflect on whether we are thinking of kind of what type of policy responses or anything else that you think we could work towards. Shall I start with Gayatri? I seem to be going in some kind of an order here, but let's stick to Gayatri and then take it from there.
Thank you for that question. It's a tough one, this one. I would say, engaging with the issue to start with at different levels would be very meaningful. So this could be starting from the household level to the family unit of family, but also then involving the employers, the government, and labor, like worker representatives. So this whole spectrum of actors. I think acknowledging, but also then discussion and then hopefully leading to action would be a meaningful point. I'm also I would also say, and this is again, what is coming from other studies across the world, and it's not actually even linked to COVID-related implications, which is something we've been talking for a very long time, of accessible, affordable, quality childcare. Not just childcare, elderly care. So care, these both aspects of care. I think affordable being the affordable and quality being the keyword. So I think this definitely Sri Lanka has quite a distance to go. So I think I will stop with those two.
Okay, so yeah, that's definitely a tough question, but maybe something to consider going forward would be, what do we think about how our education system is going forward? It's something we've known right throughout that there were inequalities. What COVID and this whole distance learning has shown us is that the gap has actually widened. Those who are at a disadvantage are at a further disadvantage now. And that would be something to really think about and consider where there is room for improvement. Yeah. I think I'll pass it on to Madhavi now.
Thanks. So I think being from the labor department, I would really look at it from the work angle. And if both the employer and the employee can accept and recognize these differences that have been made because of the COVID and because of working from home, and then duly appreciate the the responsibilities that both these parties are taking. I'm saying this because we hear instances of where employers are saying, okay, now you're not having your transport costs, you are saving on that, so might as well use it on your internet and the data and the other technical requirements that you would need to do online education, online teaching, or online working, or distance working, and everything. And at the same time, we see employers who, despite not having their normal business, who have been really doing their bit to look after their employees, and then the employees not recognizing that fact, but still coming up and saying, okay, I didn't get this. This is statutory right of mine, but I did not get that. Knowing full well that the employer was struggling to do the payment itself, the basic salary itself. And at the same time, as I said, the employees who are working from home are having multiple costs now. I've heard some of my colleagues saying that they have to use their internet, they have to use their space, electricity, light, current, all these things at their cost. And the employers are also saving on this. I think these are the things that we have to start accepting and appreciate it, and start that appreciation and discussing. And yes, flexible working has to come into the picture, but with truly recognition, because I'm increasingly hearing of instances where, okay, hereafter I'm having my phone on mute during the weekends because it's not stopping. Like the immediate boss or the employer is not stopping. Like you start giving instructions at 5, 6, 7, 8 at night. So it just continues. And then the weekend it continues. So there are people, young mothers especially, who say, no, I'm not going to do it. So I'm not responding to those calls. I think though they are working from home, we have to start accepting that there's a difference, because we are not paying for the 24 hours, we're paying for the 9-hour shift. So we should start accepting that as well. So as all the panelists said, we have to first accept the real picture and then start continuing from there to find out the best solutions.
Thank you, Madhavi, for that. That is really true. Everyone's complaining about the 24/7 clock that we seem to be on. My answer to Helani's question is to make resuming schools a top priority. And this is something I'm not saying from a personal point of view. It is. I want my kids out of my house. But there is a real anxiety in terms of sort of the loss of education and the impact it has had on children from both middle class and working class families. And also the fact that homeschooling in itself takes away from the possibility of sort of managing your work and life. I mean, certain kinds of working mothers have to give up jobs or work at night. Domestic workers, some of them have had to give up work because they need to, if they don't have care networks at home, then they have to stay back to ensure that children are doing their schoolwork. And I think the fact that our government has prioritized tourism and reviving the economy, starting workplaces over school, has had a huge impact on the well-being of the family, but also it has brought to light the kind of investment people do make with regards to children's schooling. So what we are not hearing is that the government has permitted other classes to operate. So there are, middle class families, they have the resources to send their children to extracurricular activities that have started. Sports have started, elocution classes have started, drama has started. So there is a huge push towards sending children into these activities because they have spent too much time at home. And you can see that these increase in costs is happening in working class neighborhoods because kids are going to going to tuition classes, to elocution classes, or enrolling in tuition classes because they feel that the quality of the schooling that's happening online is inadequate. And there's a massive anxiety around their children being left behind, after spending a lot of energy trying to put kids into good schools, that they have lost a whole year in which nothing much has happened. And I think in terms of a priority, I would think, making opening of schools a priority and an absolute necessity at this time over tourism and anything else that is happening at the moment.
Thank you, Asha, for bringing that up, because I think this is an issue, like, how does the state prioritize, or what does the government prioritize during this period? And this idea, and of course, or the laughter that it created for saying that, you don't want, it's not just about your kids, but in general, what does it mean for everyone to have education prioritized in this sense? I think Asha kind of responded to this question that we had from one of the participants, but it's actually also directed at Madhavi. So I think Madhavi already responded to it in some way, but I will just put it across to you anyway. Do we have a work-life balance policy in Sri Lanka or in the labor laws? Or at least at the discussion levels, given the fact that all of this has happened, given that it is also unprecedented, we could not see any encouragement from the state or at institutional levels to prioritize tasks in a way that state promotes such a work-life balance. I think I will also add to this on another conversation that Nadia also brought in, that institutionally, even within the education system, we've had this discussion before also. The idea is that the mother has to be present while the child has a Zoom class or is virtually engaging in a classroom. So what does that mean when at the moment the institutional frameworks, as Asha said, on one hand is not prioritizing education, but at the same time is also pushing these gendered roles back into the household. I know Madhavi has reflected a lot on her experiences from her perspective and from a general policy perspective, but I would appreciate if this also can be explained a little bit so that we have a little more clarity on this regard as well.
Thank you, Chandima. So I will break it into two, the government sector and the non-government, or rather the private and informal sector. When you take the government sector, we are usually bound by all our circulars and the administrative directives. So early on, when we were asked to work from home, we had this very lengthy circular from the presidential secretariat saying that, if I remember correctly, it had the times as well. We are not allowed to assign work after 4:30 to our staff. And so basically, we have to make sure that our staff works during the normal office hours. So that is there. But then in the private sector, where the normal office hours or 4:30, 5:30, that is not really practiced. It has not been practiced even pre-COVID. So when this came in, it was not, it just continued as it was. The only difference was that it was continuing as it was in homes. So then we are having discussions, especially with the flexibility and also the definition of the workplace. We are having this discussion because our law looks at workplace and defines it in a particular way. So we don't really identify a home or working from home or work or home as a workplace rather. So that discussion, I guarantee we have comments, but there's such a long way for us to go in that regard. So yes.
Thank you for that, Madhvi. I mean, it's in a sense heartening to know that the discussions have begun, that there is some kind of a process that's happening, but obviously we have to all acknowledge the fact that this is quite unprecedented. But I also want to, I think it's time for us to wrap up because we are coming right to the end of the 2-hour session. What I would like to maybe wrap up by saying a few things that came up as we discussed. As Gayatri and Nadia pointed out, the office coming to the home redefined everything that happened within the household. It was a time where even now domestic help for a specific class of women in Sri Lankan society was then denied. You had to like revisit how the gendered roles and responsibilities were divided up, and the fact that on working women there was this additional burden of, as Nadia mentioned, managing the kids' education, children's education while working and while managing the household tasks also. One of the things that I want to again emphasize is the fact that, as has been discussed so far, this has a very strong gendered element, but also, how it intersects with social class. We really don't know much as to what happened, especially among low-income households, and how they have struggled or how they coped during an extremely difficult time, and we acknowledge it. And Asha is now picking up on some of these issues. CEPA is doing some work that will hopefully, not directly, but at least show us what has happened and how people have coped or struggled or not even coped at all. It's an aspect that researchers, from a research point of view, we would have to reflect on how we kind of conduct such research during such periods of time, as Gayatri reflected upon it. But on a larger scale, this idea of organizers in chief. Yes, women have coped by doing these little things of trying to manage those 24 hours as much as possible to make sure that the home / office / school and everything else kind of, ran smoothly as much as possible. So in that kind of scenario, I think what we are also seeing, as Madhvi also said, is at least a discussion starting at the policy level to talk about this. It will obviously take a lot of time, but I also want to emphasize something that came up here, is flexi hours then the right response also. Madhvi, I think, initially said this. Flexible hours might not work in bringing women into the workforce because of what we have already seen happening, because in such pandemic situations, under these very difficult circumstances, women also tend to be struggling. So we have to also be a little more critical about what kind of policy responses we are thinking of and how we kind of make it work in order that on one hand, women can manage their household work, but also can contribute substantively in their work lives so that they are also not kind of left behind. These are some of the ideas I want to actually leave you with. There was quite an engaging conversation and back and forth in the chat boxes also, especially regarding opening of schools and who will take that responsibility. So it is, as you can see, a developing conversation that will continue to kind of maybe haunt us also, because these new ideas will come across. But let me finish by thanking you again. I know a lot of you also reflected on your own personal lives and what you all had to go through during this period. This discussion obviously will carry on. We will share as much information as possible as CEPA comes across such data, and also there is new data coming from new studies. I would like to thank Dr. Gayatri Rupuge, Nadia Najab from CEPA, Dr. Asha Besekara and Ms. Madhavi Gunawardena, who took their time, took a lot of their precious time, as we have already realized they're very busy, and engaged in this conversation, because this is something that we really needed at the Sri Lankan level, to have this kind of open conversation to see where we are heading. So I thank all of you for being part of this 63rd Open Forum on household work during COVID. And I genuinely hope and anticipate that you will engage with us in the future as well. Thank you so much.